Year 1945. The war was collapsing into silence. The thunder of artillery that once shook the Pacific had faded, leaving behind the broken echo of surrender and survival. Across the scattered islands and camps, thousands of Japanese civilians, women, mothers, children, were gathered under foreign skies, prisoners of a war they never fought directly. They had lived through bombings, starvation, and the collapse of an empire. But now the world they had feared most was the one that offered them compassion. Inside a quiet American field hospital, a line of exhausted Japanese mothers clutched their wounded infants close. Their eyes were hollow from fear, their clothes torn from days of hiding and capture. They expected punishment, humiliation, perhaps even death. But what they saw instead broke something inside them. Something they didn't know could break any further. American nurses, some barely older than the mothers themselves, moved carefully through the room. They spoke softly, not in words the mothers could understand, but in a universal language of care. Cotton cloths dipped in warm water, gentle hands dressing tiny wounds, whispered reassurances to babies who cried in pain and hunger. The mothers watched in stunned silence. Some trembled, others wept. It was not the enemy's cruelty they were witnessing, it was the enemy's kindness, and that was harder to bear. The world had changed forever. The war was over, but humanity in that moment quietly returned. 1945. The Pacific's relentless storms had finally quieted, but the silence they left behind was almost unbearable. The war had ended, yet its scars bled invisibly through those who had survived it. On a small island that once echoed with battle cries and falling shells, the air was now filled with something foreign. Softness. It came not from victory parades or the booming of cannons, but from the quiet rhythm of hands that healed instead of harmed. The Japanese women arrived in the camp as shadows of who they once were. They had been farmers' wives, teachers, sisters, and mothers. But months of hiding in jungles and abandoned villages had stripped them of everything, except the desperate instinct to protect their children. Their faces were hollow, their eyes sunken. Some carried infants so frail that they barely breathed, their skin gray from fever and malnutrition. They expected cruelty. They expected indifference. For years, they had been told that Americans were monsters, heartless conquerors who would show no mercy. And as the trucks carrying them jolted through the dirt paths into the camp, their trembling fingers tightened around their babies, ready for the worst. But what they found was silence. Not the heavy, threatening silence of dread, but one filled with calm movement. Rows of white tents flapped gently under the wind. The smell of disinfectant floated through the air, sharp yet strangely comforting. Inside the largest tent, a group of women in crisp uniforms worked swiftly, their hair tucked neatly beneath caps marked with a small red cross. These were not soldiers. These were nurses. The first Japanese mother who entered froze in place. Her feet would not move. In her arms, her baby whimpered, a weak, broken sound. The nurse nearest to her turned, her eyes soft but steady. Without a word, she stepped forward. The mother flinched, clutching her child tighter, expecting the nurse to take the baby away. Instead, the nurse reached out her hand, palm up, waiting. Slowly, patiently. The gesture was neither forceful nor hurried. It was the kind of quiet kindness that demanded trust without words. When the nurse finally touched the baby's leg, the mother gasped. The infant's skin was torn, a small wound blackened by infection. The nurse's hands moved carefully, gently peeling away the dirty bandages that had been wrapped days ago. Warm water, clean cloth, A dab of antiseptic that stung for a second, then soothed. The baby cried once, then calmed as the nurse hummed, a soft, tuneless melody. The mother stood frozen, her throat tight. She had seen soldiers bandage comrades. She had seen medics treat the wounded. But never had she seen someone hold her child with such care. Another nurse appeared beside them, carrying a tin bowl of milk. It wasn't much, but it was warm. She motioned for the mother to sit on a wooden stool and guided her trembling hands toward the spoon. The mother hesitated, tears brimming. She whispered something in Japanese, words the nurses could not understand, words like arigato, though her voice cracked halfway. The nurses smiled anyway. They didn't need to understand. Gratitude had a sound that crossed every language. In the corner of the tent, another mother watched as an American woman, barely older than 20, removed her own jacket and draped it around a shivering infant. The baby stopped crying. The mother, stunned, covered her mouth to suppress her sobs. She had wrapped her own body around the child for days during air raids, shielding it from explosions and rain, yet here was her enemy, doing the same without hesitation. The transformation was slow, fragile, and unbelievable. For days, the Japanese women remained cautious, their eyes always darting to the soldiers guarding the tents outside. But inside the medical area, something began to thaw, every small act of compassion. A bandage changed, a fever cooled, a smile returned, chipped away at the wall of hatred and fear that had been built for generations. The nurses worked tirelessly. They did not see the women as enemies. They saw them as mothers. Every cry of a hungry baby was a call they could not ignore. They scrounged for extra rations of milk, crushed biscuits into paste, and shared whatever they could find to feed the infants. Sometimes they took turns holding the babies through the night so the mothers could sleep for the first time in weeks. And every morning, when the sun filtered through the thin fabric of the tents, the women would wake to find the nurses already moving, measuring temperatures, changing bandages, washing tiny faces. It was care in its purest form. It was not charity, not politics, just humanity. But for the Japanese mothers, that kindness was almost unbearable. Their world had been built on pride, duty, and endurance. They had been told that surrender was dishonor, and that compassion from the enemy was a lie. Yet here they were, surrounded by women who spoke softly, smiled gently, and treated their babies as if they were their own. Some mothers averted their gaze out of shame. They did not know how to reconcile their loyalty to their homeland with the gratitude that burned quietly inside them. At night, when the camp lamps dimmed and only the distant hum of crickets filled the air, whispers echoed in the tents. Mothers spoke to one another in hushed tones. "Why do they help us?" one would ask. Another would shake her head. "Maybe they pity us." But then, a voice, older, quieter, would say, "Maybe they are mothers too." And silence would follow, the kind of silence that came from truth. The nurses didn't know those conversations were happening. They only knew that every time they entered the tent now, the women smiled shyly instead of hiding. When a baby was lifted to be cleaned or fed, the mother would bow deeply. Some even began to help each other, mimicking what they saw the nurses do, folding bandages neatly, boiling cloth in pots of water, organizing the supplies as best they could. Compassion was contagious. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the nurses gathered by the camp fence to breathe for a moment. Their uniforms were stained with sweat, their hands red from work. The youngest among them, barely 19, looked back toward the tents and said softly, I never thought they'd look at us without fear." Her superior placed a hand on her shoulder. "Fear dies slower than war," she said. "But tonight, I think it's dying." Inside, the mothers were rocking their babies. The faint smell of medicine hung in the air, but it was now mixed with something gentler, the scent of milk and clean cloth. One woman, whose baby had nearly died of infection, wept silently as she watched her child sleep peacefully for the first time since the war began. She looked toward the nurse's tent and whispered a prayer, not for victory or revenge, but for gratitude. The war had stripped away everything: homes, pride, security. But inside that fragile camp, something miraculous had taken root. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of understanding. The mothers still feared what the future held, but for the first time in years, they allowed themselves to hope that their children might grow up in a world less cruel than the one they had known. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. The air inside the hospital tents had grown quieter over time, but it was not an empty silence. It was a silence thick with emotion, like the hush after a long cry. By now, the Japanese women had come to trust the rhythm of the camp. The once strange smell of antiseptic had become familiar. The white canvas walls no longer felt like barriers, but like the arms of a place that sheltered them from the chaos beyond. Yet something deeper stirred beneath the surface, something words could not reach. Language stood between the nurses and the mothers like an invisible wall. No dictionary could bridge it, no translator could fully explain the weight of what passed between them. The American nurses spoke softly to one another as they worked. Phrases like, "Hand me the gauze, she needs rest," or "The baby's temperature's dropping." To the Japanese women, these words were only sounds, but they began to recognize meaning through gestures, expressions, and tone. A smile replaced translation. A nod became understanding. Every act of care was a conversation without speech. A mother would lift her baby hesitantly toward a nurse, unsure if it was allowed. The nurse would gently take the child, her hands warm, her eyes calm, and the mother would exhale, as though releasing days of fear in a single breath. When the nurse returned the baby, clean, fed, and wrapped, the mother would bow deeply, pressing her forehead to the nurse's hand, trembling. The nurse didn't always know what to do in response. Sometimes she simply placed her palm against the mother's back, steadying her as she cried. There were many tears in those days. Tears of pain, of exhaustion, of a sorrow so heavy it could only escape through trembling shoulders. The nurses began to understand that these women were not merely prisoners. They were survivors of something unspeakable. One nurse wrote in her personal journal that she had never seen such silent strength. "They do not complain," she wrote. "They do not ask for anything. They simply bow and then they cry." In those quiet exchanges, something powerful began to grow. A fragile bridge built on empathy. Neither side could explain it in words, but they could feel it in the air, in the small moments when human hearts recognized one another across enemy lines. One afternoon, a young mother named Hannah, her name later remembered because she whispered it once, stood beside her baby's cot. The infant had developed a fever, and the nurses had worked through the night to keep her temperature stable. Hannah hadn't slept. She sat beside the cot, her hands clasped, her lips moving in prayer. When morning came, the fever broke. The nurse on duty, an American named Claire, smiled, exhaling relief. Hannah looked up at her, her face pale, eyes glistening. She didn't know how to say thank you. Instead, she reached out, taking Claire's hand, and pressed it against her own forehead. Claire froze, not understanding the gesture, then realized it was reverence. It was gratitude so deep it had no words. In that moment, Claire's eyes filled with tears too. Not from pity, but from something far heavier. A realization that the woman before her, who had once been considered the enemy, loved her child in the same way Claire's own mother had loved her. That realization changed her. It changed many of them. The days in the camp began to flow with a strange, fragile peace. The nurses and mothers moved around one another like dancers who understood the choreography without ever rehearsing it. A bowl handed across a table, a cloth dipped in water and wrung dry, a small laugh shared over a baby's hiccup. These were tiny, almost invisible moments, but they carried the weight of reconciliation. The war had taught both sides to dehumanize. It had painted entire nations in shades of hatred and fear. But inside those tents, all of that dissolved. The nurses saw not Japanese mothers, but mothers. The women saw not Americans, but caretakers. At times, the silence between them was so profound that it felt like the camp itself was breathing. A baby's cry would pierce the air, followed by soft footsteps and gentle shushing. The light from the kerosene lamps would flicker, catching on the nurses' faces, faces drawn with exhaustion yet illuminated with compassion. Outside, soldiers marched and trucks rumbled past, reminders that the world beyond still bore the marks of destruction. But inside, the war seemed to hold its breath. And then came the day the tears flowed without restraint. A baby, one of the smallest in the camp, didn't survive. Malnutrition and infection had done what medicine could not undo. The mother, a frail woman in her 20s, held her lifeless child for hours, refusing to let go. The nurses didn't try to take the baby from her. They simply sat beside her in silence. One nurse placed a small flower, a white daisy, plucked from outside the tent, on the baby's chest. The mother saw it, and the tears came like a storm. She fell forward, her forehead pressing against the ground, her sobs echoing through the camp. The nurses cried too. They didn't care about sides anymore. There were no flags in that moment, no victors or captives. Only women who understood loss. That night, after the child was buried near the camp's edge, the mother placed a folded piece of paper atop the small grave. The nurses later unfolded it. The words written in broken English read, "Thank you for loving my baby." No one spoke about it after. But something in the camp shifted. The Japanese women, once silent and wary, began to look at the nurses differently. They began to smile more. They began to help, not out of obligation, but out of shared spirit. When a baby cried, several mothers would rush to calm it while the nurses prepared milk or bandages. When one nurse fell ill from exhaustion, the Japanese women brought her food. Bowing low at her bedside, it was no longer the story of prisoners and caretakers. It was the story of women keeping each other alive. The nurses often wondered what the mothers must have thought of them. Some wrote in their journals, trying to imagine the unspoken emotions behind those bowed heads. One entry read, "I think they cry because they cannot believe the war is truly over. They cry because kindness is harder to accept than cruelty." Years later, when the war was a memory fading into books and museums, some of those Japanese women would write their own reflections. They spoke of the fear they carried, the shame they felt, and the moment it began to dissolve when a nurse touched their baby's hand. One woman wrote, "I did not know the enemy could love. That day, I understood we are all mothers before we are anything else." That sentiment, simple, profound, captured what those weeks in the camp had truly meant. For the nurses, it was not heroism. They had not saved the world. They had simply done what their hearts demanded to heal where healing was possible. But they did not realize that their actions would ripple far beyond that small field hospital. Their tenderness would become the quiet proof that even in the ashes of war, humanity could still bloom. As the days grew warmer, the camp became almost serene. Children began to giggle again. Mothers washed clothes near the small stream, chatting softly among themselves. The nurses taught them simple hygiene routines and how to make makeshift diapers from bandages. The laughter that followed those lessons was the first sound of joy many had heard in years. One afternoon, a group of mothers gathered near the tent entrance. Bowing deeply as the nurses passed by, they presented small gifts, woven bracelets made from thread, a paper crane folded from old medicine wrappers, a simple drawing of a mother holding a baby. The nurses accepted them with quiet awe. They didn't realize until later that each gift had been made by hand during sleepless nights, crafted in gratitude that words could not express. In those small exchanges, the boundaries that once divided two nations dissolved completely. No one could explain it logically. It wasn't politics or forgiveness. It was simply the recognition of shared humanity. The war had taken so much from both sides, but it had not taken their capacity to care. And as the final weeks in the camp passed, the mothers began to laugh more freely. Some even sang lullabies at night, their soft voices blending with the sounds of crickets and rustling tents. The nurses often paused in their duties just to listen. It was the sound of peace being reborn, one whisper, one tear, one heartbeat at a time. By the time the Japanese women were transferred out, there was no need for words. Their eyes said everything. They bowed, some weeping openly, others smiling through tears. The nurses waved as the trucks carried them away, unsure if they would ever see them again. But they would remember forever. The bowed heads, the trembling hands, the quiet thank yous spoken without sound. It was in that silence that humanity had spoken loudest. The camp had settled into a rhythm that felt almost unreal after the chaos of war. The sound of explosions had been replaced by the rustle of wind through the canvas tents, the distant laughter of babies, and the quiet murmuring of women who, for the first time in years, were learning what peace felt like. The nurses moved gently through the aisles each morning, their shoes soft against the dirt floors, carrying trays of food, bandages, and bottles of milk. The Japanese mothers had begun to anticipate their footsteps, those quiet, measured steps that meant another day of safety had arrived. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. In the beginning, the mothers had slept with one eye open, their arms wrapped tightly around their infants, as though the world might steal them away again. But now, many slept soundly through the night. Babies who once whimpered in fear now giggled, their small hands clutching at the fabric of the nurse's sleeves. Every small sound, every breath of calm, felt sacred. The nurses had transformed the camp into something more than a place of recovery. It had become a sanctuary. The tents were decorated with makeshift curtains sewn from spare sheets, and small flowers had been planted outside in tin cans and empty ration tins. The nurses said it was to keep the insects away, but everyone knew it was really for beauty, for the reminder that life could still grow even here. At night, when the lanterns glowed softly and the air cooled, the camp would fall into a serenity that felt almost holy. The nurses would sit outside, sipping coffee that had long since lost its flavor, watching the horizon fade from orange to deep blue. Inside the tents, mothers sang to their babies, their lullabies floating gently through the camp. Though the nurses couldn't understand the words, the emotion was unmistakable, a bittersweet blend of sorrow and hope. Some of the women had lost husbands in the war, others had lost everything. Yet here, among strangers, they had found something they thought was gone forever: compassion. The nurses never spoke of politics, never mentioned victory or defeat. Their actions said everything. Every bandage tied, every wound cleaned, every hand held was a declaration that the war might have ended, but mercy was still alive. The transformation was slow, like dawn breaking after a long night. At first, the women had been cautious, unsure whether the kindness was real or temporary. But over time, they began to trust. They began to live again. One woman, named Yumi, had arrived at the camp, nearly unconscious, clutching a child so thin that it seemed more spirit than flesh. The baby had refused to eat, too weak even to cry. The nurses had taken turns nursing her through the nights, feeding her drops of milk at a time, until her strength returned. Weeks later, when that same baby laughed for the first time, a soft, bubbling laugh that startled everyone, the entire tent had fallen silent. Then, one by one, the mothers began to smile. The sound of that laughter filled the camp like a song, and for a moment, everyone forgot they were prisoners of war. Moments like that became the heartbeat of the camp. The soldiers who guarded the perimeter often paused to watch. They had seen enough horror to make them numb. Yet something about this quiet, almost sacred atmosphere unsettled them. The war had taught them to hate, to obey, to see the enemy as faceless. But here, they saw women cradling children and nurses cradling both. They saw humanity staring back at them, and it changed them too. Days turned to weeks, and the camp began to look less like a prison and more like a small village. Mothers helped wash clothes, fetched water, and tended to small vegetable patches planted beside the tents. Nurses organized reading lessons for the children and even taught a few mothers how to speak simple English words: milk, baby, thank you. In return, the mothers taught them a few words of Japanese: arigato, hokasan, WWII. Thank you, mother, not bad. These lessons often ended in laughter. Pronunciations tangled, gestures grew animated, and for brief moments, there were no sides, only women trying to connect. At sunset, when the day's work was done, the nurses and mothers would sometimes sit together under the fading light, sharing stories through gestures and drawings in the dirt. The nurses spoke of home, of fields in Iowa, of rivers in Oregon, of snow in New York. The mothers listened, their eyes distant, thinking of the rice fields and gardens they had left behind. In those shared silences, they realized that though the war had been waged between their nations, the pain it left behind was the same. For the Japanese mothers, the most astonishing thing was the absence of vengeance. They had prepared themselves for cruelty, for humiliation. But none came. When their children laughed, the nurses laughed with them. When they cried, the nurses held them close. That tenderness disarmed them more than any weapon ever could. It was during these quiet weeks that a strange new ritual began. The mothers, grateful for the care they had received, started leaving small gifts behind, tokens of gratitude crafted from whatever they could find. One mother folded paper cranes out of old medical wrappers. Another used threads from torn clothes to weave tiny bracelets. A few drew simple pictures using charcoal from burned firewood. Images of nurses holding babies, of tents under the sun, of hands clasped together. They left these small treasures on the nurses' tables, usually at night, too shy to present them directly. In the morning, the nurses would find them humble, beautiful reminders that kindness had taken root where hatred once grew. One morning, Nurse Helen discovered a small wooden carving beside her cot. It was shaped like a bird, roughly made, but unmistakably full of meaning. She didn't know who had carved it, but inside the wings were faint Japanese characters scratched with a pin. Later, she learned they meant freedom. She kept that carving for the rest of her life. Even after the war's end, long after they had all gone home, the nurses and mothers carried those memories with them like quiet treasures. For the mothers, it was proof that even in defeat, dignity could be restored. For the nurses, it was proof that compassion could survive any battlefield. When the time finally came for the Japanese women and children to be released and sent home, the camp grew strangely quiet again. The nurses lined up outside the trucks, watching as the mothers packed the few belongings they had. There were tears on both sides, though few words were exchanged. The mothers bowed deeply, their children clinging to their skirts. Some tried to speak, "Thank you," "good," "safe," words they had practiced for days but could barely pronounce through their sobs. The nurses waved, smiling through their own tears. One by one, the trucks began to move. As they rumbled away, small hands waved from the back, and the air filled with a bittersweet stillness. It was the end of something rare and sacred. A fleeting glimpse of what peace between enemies could look like when stripped of politics and pride. When the nurses walked back into the now empty tents, they found a few final gifts left behind paper cranes arranged neatly on the tables, small bundles of flowers tied with scraps of cloth, and one note written in careful, shaky English. It read, "We'll go home, but we take your kindness with us. You are not envied." No one spoke for a long time after reading it. The camp didn't close immediately. For a while, the nurses stayed to pack supplies, clean the tents, and help the remaining soldiers move on. But the air felt different now, heavier, lonelier. The laughter of the children was gone, replaced by the distant hum of insects and the occasional crackle of the campfire. Yet in that quiet, something remained. It wasn't emptiness. It was the echo of humanity. Months later, when the nurses returned home to America, they carried those memories like invisible scars. Some couldn't talk about what they'd seen. Others spoke of it only in whispers to those who would understand. They remembered the faces of the mothers, the way they bowed, the way they cried, not in fear but in gratitude. And they remembered the babies, their small hands reaching for light after so much darkness. Years passed. Wars ended, new ones began, and history marched forward. But in the private diaries of those nurses and the memories of those mothers, that brief encounter remained a quiet miracle. It was proof that even in the aftermath of unimaginable cruelty, compassion could still bloom. It wasn't a grand story of triumph or conquest. There were no medals, no parades, no headlines. But for those who lived it, it was more powerful than any victory. It was the story of healing, not just of bodies, but of hearts. And somewhere, perhaps on a forgotten shelf or in a drawer in an old home, a few of those paper cranes still exist, faded, fragile, yet unbroken. They are symbols of a truth too simple and too profound for history books to capture, that when all else is lost, kindness can still build a bridge between worlds once torn apart. In that quiet camp under a foreign sky, They had not only mended wounds, they had mended what it meant to be human.